Second.
Oh.
One second. I gotta pull it up the website real quick. Got too many things pulled up. And okay. Welcome everybody to our medical billing for pharmacists platform. And today we have with us Dr. Zach Roscoe, who will be going over our topic presentation today, drug benefit versus medical benefit and the language of medical billing 101. Following Dr. Roscoe's presentation, we'll enter into a question and answer and discussion section. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Roscoe.
All right, thank you, Dr. Wadsworth. As mentioned, today's topic is going to be a pretty high-level introduction to kind of the difference between the medical benefit and pharmacy benefit, why we kind of need to know the differences there and pay attention to that and what that means for billing for pharmacist non-dispensing services, and a little bit of the language that you'll hear and need to know about as we go about talking about building practices or billing for clinical services. So I will say right off the bat, some of this is not going to be new information to a lot of you based on where you work or your practice history, but I think it's good to get a refresher and all be on the same page. So there are well more than two benefit types that cover healthcare services, and we can talk about vision benefits and dental benefits just as other examples, but we're going to really focus on medical benefits and pharmacy benefits. They often come together in the same plan, but are administered differently, typically with pharmacy benefits administered by a PBM or a pharmacy benefit manager, and a medical plan directly administering the medical benefits. Under a typical medical benefit plan that covers outpatient services and inpatient and other things such as skilled nursing and durable medical equipment and other supplies. Under the pharmacy benefits, this is what we're obviously a lot more familiar with. That's going to be coverage for outpatient medications, depending upon the class of the benefits that may include Part D medication therapy management services or other MTM services, dispensing services, so not just the coverage of the drug itself, but the coverage of the associated services for preparation, counseling, dispensing, and certain other care plan activities under that pharmacy benefit. Now, just like there are different types of benefits, so medical versus pharmacy benefit, there are different types of payer classes that we need to pay attention to because the rules and coverages associated with them are going to be different based on the payer class. So on one side, we have federal plans, specifically Medicare for older individuals and those who are disabled. And that can be administered in one of two ways. There can be traditional Medicare, which is going to be administered with, you'll see patients with the red, white, and blue card. And that's with Part B covering outpatient medical services and Part A covering inpatient and skilled nursing services. And then potentially, if the patient enrolls a Part D plan covering prescription drugs. But you can also see some commercial gap coverage or coverage that goes on top of traditional Medicare or type Part C plans, which bundle all of those services together and may administer the pharmacy benefits and the outpatient and hospital services together. Under other federal programs, well, government-funded programs, though administered on the state level, you have the CMS, so Medicaid plans, or you might have state insurance exchange plans, which are broken up into pharmaceutical services and have associated rules at the state level, medical and surgical services, and then hospital and facility services. So you'll see these written out as FQHC or RHC clinic services or in hospital services, for example. And there's typically a rule set in each state's laws that is going to detail what is and is not covered in state Medicaid services. These can also be administered by commercial entities in managed Medicaid. We don't have a diagram for that on here, but they may administer single elements of or break these services up in contract with the PBM to provide the pharmacy benefit, for example. And then there's our commercial benefits, which may be exclusive to providing services in a specific state or maybe national, but we have commercial benefits that are going to each administer their benefits in a little bit of a different way. Typically, the outpatient and hospital services are bundled under the commercial benefit plan. And when you enroll in that commercial benefit, whether through your employer or directly or a small group, that comes along with a pharmacy benefit that is outsourced to a PBM. Now, just a little more detail on what is actually covered under the pharmacy benefit. So under actual reimbursed products and services, this includes prescription medications that are filled at a pharmacy. This includes immunization serums. Sometimes this is can get flipped on the back end to the medical benefit, but in general, most pharmacy benefits will cover at least some immunizations, and that also will include professional fees associated with the administration, so administration fees for that immunization. It will include dispensing fees that are required under OBRA 90. So that's the professional services of the pharmacist for filling that prescription that is dispensed. So there's while we typically see one net reimbursement and a patient sees one copay, that entire claim actually has two components. That's the ingredient cost, the ingredient fee, and then there's also the administration fee. Just like with the immunization under the pharmacy benefit, there's the serum cost and the administration fee. And then this, in some situations, will also have some other reimbursements, whether it's directly considered a covered service and reimbursed as a service or an administrative cost, but there may be some coverage depending upon the plan and the benefit type. You'll see with some commercial plans or some state level plans where they may cover medication therapy management under the pharmacy benefit, under a state Medicaid plan, or some select commercial plans under a specific group. They may cover things such as an additional reimbursement for REMS services. So clozapine monitoring, things like that. And that may be done through payment of an additional administration fee on a dispensation. It could be done with dummy NDC codes. There are some vendors that help set up dummy NDCs that can be submitted through the pharmacy point of sale. But one thing to call out is that under a Medicare Part D plan, while Part D is covered under the MTM is covered under Part D under the pharmacy benefit, that comes out of the administrative costs and is not coming out of the covered services section of their benefit line. Under medical benefits, we've already kind of gone over the typical covered services, outpatient, inpatient services, and DME, but services under a medical benefit, payment is for services that are to provide diagnosis, treatment, prevention, or amelioration of some type of medical problem. Not all medical benefit plans cover preventative services, but many do. Commercial plans and Medicaid plans are more typically going to cover preventative services. A lot of Medicare plans are unable to cover preventative services and require there to be a specific problem. And these are going to be reimbursed based on submitting several pieces of information to the medical payer. They're adjudicated after the fact, after the service has been provided. And these are reimbursed based on submission of an ICD-10 code, a CPT code indicating the service that was provided, a place of service code, and also the NPI of the provider or practice performing the services. Now, some medical benefit plans will cover MTM services as well as these other healthcare services. That is highly dependent on the payer themselves and state law. So a lot of states will cover MTM under the medical benefit, and that will be a reimbursable service when billed to the medical benefit plan. Medicare plans, whether Advantage or not, typically do not cover MTM at all under the medical benefit because it is written into rule as part of the pharmacy administrative costs, pharmacy benefit administrative costs. And every once in a while, a commercial plan will have negotiated payment for MTM services under the medical benefit, but more typically they kind of kick that to their PBM line of service if it is something they have worked into a commercial group plan. Now, why does it matter what the differences between these, and what does the difference look like at the actual point of service? So when we bill a prescription, when we get a prescription sent to a pharmacy for a patient, the prescription is received, whether it's brought in, sent electronically to the pharmacy, and we have information on the drug, and the patient provides their insurance plan information, their pharmacy benefit plan, and we can bill prior to the service actually being rendered and provided. So we get real-time adjudication of at least what we are going to initially get reimbursed, and the patient can see what their associated copay is going to be and decide if they want to accept that service or if we need to have discussions about finding an alternative. So once insurance is processed, once the patient is informed and they agree, the prescription is actually dispensed, the patient receives it, and ultimately the pharmacy will collect on the revenue cycle that reimbursement. Now, most of us are all familiar with issues in pharmacy benefit managers with DIR fees and clawbacks. So it may be months, weeks, years later, we may see associated fees or charges come in or just get taken out of our next reimbursement to the pharmacy, saying that there were service fees or incentive fees or quality metrics that weren't met, and part of that previous prescription is being clawed back. Now, anytime something is billed and processed through the pharmacy benefit manager, unless state law has been put in place to prohibit it or federal law, if we use dummy NDCs or we get paid through administrative benefits of the pharmacy benefit plan, there is some risk of similar actions from PBMs carving back reimbursement or components of reimbursement for non-dispensing pharmacist services. Immunizations that could be billed under the medical benefit but are billed under the pharmacy benefit and administered through a PBM have the same risk of clawbacks that other prescriptions do. And we have seen practices that have had large components of even COVID vaccine administration clawed back after the fact. That is not a practice that is happening on the medical benefit side. So when you have the option to bill the medical benefit or the pharmacy benefit, if you're set up to do both, and you look at not just the baseline reimbursement, but net reimbursement, oftentimes you're going to get a higher reimbursement rate on the medical benefit side, and you're also going to have that protection and assurance that unless the service was improperly administered, the reimbursement you end up receiving from the medical benefit will be yours. You'll get to keep that. So just one reason why when we have discussions about, expanding access to pharmacist services through reimbursement, we want to make sure that that reimbursement is not just, proper reimbursement for the service, but that it's reimbursement as other providers get reimbursed under the medical benefit and out of the grasp of PBMs. Now, there are some differences to be aware of, however, that kind of limit practices in starting or are just nuances that need to be appreciated when you start billing the medical benefit, is that the revenue cycle is very different. Under a medical benefit claim, we provide the service before reimbursement is received, and often before we know what the patient's copay is going to be. Certain services are really well defined on a patient's benefit plan, and they may be aware of that. These may be posted on benefits descriptions if you look up the group. And in a medical clinic, there are scheduling agents who typically will verify that insurance is still active the day before or day of a medical service to ensure the patient doesn't get provided a service and then hit with the full bill if they were, lapsed and forgot to update information with the medical plan. But that is a standard process with a medical practice, is to confirm benefits coverage ahead of time. And if this is for an office visit type service, as opposed to an administration of a drug, you typically have that individual confirm what a patient copay is going to be and what needs to be collected at the time of service. This isn't something that has to be done, but it's a standard process to help alleviate and minimize the risk of patients being lost to follow-up and not paying their component of the bill. Now, you can bypass all of that and provide the service to the patient, have them sign, waivers and agreements of financial liability and do all of the collections after the fact and after claims adjudication, but that leaves more risk. So the standard process, we have the service provided, we have documentation of the service, we have coding of the documentation for that service. So that documentation is translated into the CPT and ICD-10 codes and place a service code to be submitted to the medical benefit plan. That claim is then submitted to the medical benefit plan, typically electronically, which could include fax or email. Very rarely, there are still paper claims being mailed in, but few, if any, practices are doing that on any scale at this point in time. And then there's a process of adjudication that typically within a month of submission, you will, and this may vary based on state law because some laws are in place that regulate how quickly they have to respond to claims, submissions, and there's also claims submitting deadlines placed upon the practice themselves. So if you wait too long, you might not even be able to get reimbursement, but eventually you'll get an adjudication on that claim and you'll get payment based on a contracted rate. If you're in network, you may get an out-of-network rate if you're out of network, if out-of-network services are covered, or you will get simply a notice that the patient is responsible for the full amount or the contracted amount of that service, and then you go to collection, where you send a statement to the patient and collect it either from them the next time they come in or via a mailed statement to them. So the process is a bit different and does require some knowledge of different steps in the revenue cycle and requires oversight of claims, because if a claim gets rejected and you need to submit new information or different information, if you don't do that in a certain amount of time and have someone looking at that, you will never get reimbursed for the service that you've already provided. So a bit of a difference in the actual processing and collection of payment. Now, shifting away from the differences between the two benefits, we're going to go into just a little bit of the language of medical billing and some of the kind of prerequisites for billing that you'll need to know about. And these will help as we discuss what it looks like to actually code for specific cases and what reimbursement might look like for those cases in future sessions. So the first thing we're going to go over here is credentialing. And when I talk about credentialing, there really are two different processes of credentialing. There's internal, which is facility credentialing with the facility, and there's external credentialing, which is credentialing with a medical payer. And when we're talking about billing, that's more of the one I'm talking about right here. And regardless of how this is done, or which form is done, internal or external, the process is very similar. There's a collection of data about a provider who wants to participate, whether in providing services at a practice or getting reimbursed for services provided to a patient under a medical benefit plan. They want to participate in that plan. Either the practice or the payer needs to collect data on that pharmacist or other healthcare provider, review that data, and determine if that provider meets their baseline requirements for being a participating pharmacist or a participating nurse practitioner, for example, in their plan or practice. Now, as I mentioned, both of these processes are very similar. It's just where the end product, the data on the pharmacist, is going, and the outcome is a little bit different. So the typical types of information that are going to be collected are going to be case history for any malpractice claims against the individual, licenses, board certifications, continuing education, previous privileges and credentialing at other facilities, malpractice insurance, and past practice sites, and so forth. So this information is gathered, submitted to the practice or health plan, and that's reviewed. And for internal credentialing at a facility, clinic, pharmacy, the desired outcome, so the reason a pharmacist would be submitting a credentialing application in this data would be to gain privileging. and we'll talk about privileging in a moment. When submitting to a health benefit plan, the desired outcome is contracting or being attached to an existing contract. So the way an individual who wants to be a participating provider and get reimbursed for services as an in-network provider in a health plan, the first step they're really going to go through is submitting or requesting credentialing with that health plan. And we'll talk a little bit more about that cycle as well. So just as an example here, external credentialing, as I mentioned, the end result, the desired goal here is to be granted credentials and be in a participating provider or a credentialed provider with that health plan. This is an example of a credentialing response letter for a submitted application to a commercial benefit plan. And there's more steps than just submitting the credentialing, but once you get through credentialing, as I mentioned here, this is a notice to myself saying I had been granted credentialing with Providence Health Plan. The next step would be contracting, if there was not already a contract to attach me to. So 2 different teams are going to handle this, and there's multiple steps in the process. Before we go on to the contracting process, just talk about privileging real fast. And this is a concept that often gets mixed and convoluted with credentialing because they typically happen simultaneously or just in a very short order. It's the process of credentialing and privileging. As soon as you submit for credentialing at a facility and you're granted credentialing, it typically moves right into the privileging process because that is the intended outcome of credentialing. It doesn't really much matter if you're a credentialed provider at a clinic or at a pharmacy that has a credentialing and privileging process. If you don't get granted privileges, you're just a pharmacist who's in the dispensing pharmacy team or a pharmacist who's on the inpatient pharmacy team, but you haven't been given any scope of authority or services. So privileging is the process by which a facility specifically grants and details your permissions as a provider of that medical staff or pharmacy staff in their sites. So this essentially details your scope of practice at that facility. The clinical privileges that are going to be contained within your privileging at a facility are almost always less broad than the state's or federal scope of practice. They certainly cannot be broader than the state or federal scope of practice. But in general, there are reasons both for patient safety and from a liability standpoint from the employer's side that you would want to limit a provider's scope of practice to only certain services that you can verify they're competent and experienced to perform at that site. The example I like to use all the time, and I actually used at a meeting, a regional meeting in Oregon with some board of pharmacy members, and they kind of realized, oh, this actually might be permissible. That's odd. State scope of practice in Oregon, for example, states that a pharmacist may administer any drug or device that they have training and competence to perform, and they just have to be able to document that they have the training to perform that. Well, an IUD is a drug or device. So do you really want a pharmacist placing an IUD in a patient in one of your sites? If you grant privileges that say a pharmacist may administer any drugs or devices to patients, you might have a pharmacist who schedules patients to administer an IUD or place an IUD. I doubt it would happen, but if it did and something went wrong and you put privileging in place that said a pharmacist could do that, you are now liable for negligent privileging and you have put patients at risk of harm. So from a perspective of the employer or the practice manager, you want to have privileges in place so that a pharmacist knows what their bounds are and that if they take action outside of those bounds, that liability falls on them and you can take proper action. From the pharmacist side, the individual clinician, you want to know what you're allowed to do at your site and what you're not allowed to do. And oftentimes these are put in place as well to protect the pharmacist. If you just have one clinical pharmacist and you're starting services and you have some providers who really want them to do certain services that you know are not really going to be value added to growing the service or to the patient population, but just help that provider's practice, you can exclude them from privileging and give that pharmacist some extra support in saying, hey, that's outside of my privileging. I'm not allowed to do that in these facilities. So that's privileging. The difference between credentialing and privileging, really, credentialing just being the review to say someone meets the basic qualifications to fall into a clinician role in the medical or pharmacy staff at this site, and the privileging is the specific what they're allowed to do. So shifting to the outcome of external credentialing with payers, that's medical contracting. And this isn't all that different from contracting with a pharmacy benefit, though the biggest difference is there actually is some ability to negotiate. Unlike pharmacy benefit contracts, which are all take it or leave it, you really have no wiggle room. You can go back and forth on rates and various terms with the medical benefit plans. As I mentioned, typically, if this is, let's say you're a pharmacy or a practice just starting to open or start to bill for clinical services, you might have to request a contract. So some plans will have you request a contract to get started. Some will have you submit a credentialing application before you can formally request a contract, but typically either a request for contract or submission of a credentialing application will, when approved, result in notice to request a contract or request to be added to an existing contract. When you get that draft, as I mentioned, you do have the ability to review, negotiate, and then if you can meet the terms, many of times on the dispensing community pharmacy side, some of the terms that get in the way are the requirements to have hospital admitting privileges, 24-hour call coverage, and a 24-hour answering service. Sometimes those can be negotiated, or you can work with other partners to provide those elements of service for you. But once you come to terms and execute that contract, then you can start providing services as an in-network provider. Now, this does not pertain to pharmacists at present, but I think it's important to know the difference, and I'll call out that when we talk about this process for contracting with health plans, requesting credentialing and contracting, that is going to be an exclusive process for commercial plans, and then also for managed Medicare and managed Medicaid plans. But with managed Medicare and Medicaid plans, you do have to either have your Medicaid ID or Medicare ID before you go and request to be in contract. Kind of caveat for Medicare Advantage plans, we'll talk about that at a different time. But for a non-pharmacist provider recognized by Medicare, they don't start with a request for credentialing or contracting. It's simply an enrollment. Enrollment equals contracting and credentialing for Medicare and Medicaid. So the rules, the contract, are federal or state laws. So there's no separate contract to sign for Medicare as a provider. You are enrolling. Your enrollment application attests that you will follow federal rules for Medicare. Your submission to get a state Medicaid ID, any signatures on there, is an attestation that you will follow state and federal law pertaining to Medicaid. So under state Medicaid, we can get granted a Medicaid ID. Medicare, we still cannot directly enroll. But that would be the process of credentialing and contracting for a federal program, federal or state program. Then the difference is if there is a state managed Medicaid entity, after getting your Medicaid ID, you go through the same process you would for a commercial health plan. Now, as we talk about actually submitting claims, we'll talk about the different codes in different different presentations coming up. But for outpatient services, which are primarily what we do billing for, these are all billed off of the same claim form. It's a HCFA 1500, CMS 1500 form. This is kind of an example of what it looks like. We can go into more detail on what goes into each field, but realistically, this is auto-generated. If you're in a larger clinic system, you have a billing team who auto-generates this. Much of it is automatically done by your electronic medical record. On the pharmacy side, if you're starting services in a dispensing pharmacy, you may need a little more training in how to independently fill these out, because some EMRs allow you to fill out each field and submit this or automate some of it. But there are also different vendors who will do full service filling these out and submitting them for you and managing the revenue cycle. So it really just falls on how much you want to get involved in managing your claims yourselves. But I think it's important that everyone knows there's one standardized form, and this is where the patient information, the provider and practice information, and those codes that indicate the service that was provided, why it was provided, by whom, when, and where get submitted. Oh, one other thing to call out, I forgot, that we often hear in relation to the submission of a claim, the terms billing provider and rendering provider. Now, rendering provider is important because that is the provider who actually has authority for and supervision over the service being provided. So when we talk about pharmacists being the individual submitting and getting reimbursed directly for a medical service, we're talking about a pharmacist being the rendering provider. That is billed with our NPI, and it's based on our autonomy and our supervision and responsibility for the service being provided. So there are certain situations where the person actually performing the service is not the rendering provider. And that's what historically pharmacists have been relegated to incident to reimbursement, which is when to Medicare or a commercial health plan, for example, a pharmacist provides a service under an established plan of care and under the supervision of a Medicare recognized provider. And that Medicare provider is in the office supervising that service when it's performed. Yes, that whole service may be performed by the pharmacist, but the Medicare provider is responsible for that service and is the one who authorized it. So they're the rendering provider. And that's an example of an incident to service where that service performed by the pharmacist was incident to the physician or non-physician practitioner service. Their name goes out as the rendering provider. Billing provider on the claim is indicating whether, if this is a single provider practice, the individual may be the billing provider, so it could be the same as the rendering provider. But in most cases, we either have a billing service who's submitting claims and collecting them on behalf of a provider, or a group practice where the practice's NPI actually goes in as the billing provider and maybe the base individual or base entity on the contract with the medical payer. So it could be, Broadway medical practice NPI as the billing provider with X pharmacist as the rendering provider. And I think this is the last slide kind of talking about definitions. And this is the other thing you'll hear is participating and non-participating provider. And this really pertains to network status. So as I mentioned, there's multiple steps in getting contracted and eligible or ready to bill for services as an in-network provider. Credentialing with a medical plan and getting granted credentialing says you are eligible to participate in our plan as the type of provider you are, but you're not yet participating because you don't have a contract. You're not attached to a contract. So you can be credentialed with a medical plan and still not be in network. You don't have any terms of reimbursement that are different than someone who's non-credentialed. So you are out of network at that point. Once you have a contract, and that contract will specify if you're on all of the groups, just some of the groups, you are then a participating provider, at least under the groups associated with that contract. On the other side, you can be a non-participating provider if you're either just credentialed, you're neither credentialed nor contracted, or in some rare cases, you'll have a credentialed contracted provider who switched practices and is now at a clinic that does not have a contract with the medical plan. So even if the provider themselves has a contract, but that contract is not attached to the billing provider, so the practice, they may still be considered a non-participating provider. So there's also a separate thing to consider and a separate credentialing process for facilities with medical benefit plans. Now, that's why we talk about attaching to an existing contract, where most group practices have the base contract and have a process to credential providers and have them attached to that base contract. So that was a lot of information and very high level at that. We could go into a lot more detail on those topics, but Tom, I know we were going to open it up to maybe some specific questions, but let's do questions, I think, on these topics first.
Yeah, so let's do open that up. Thank you, Dr. Roscoe. That was a good review and a reminder for some and new for others. And so we'll open that up to questions to the group. Does anybody have any questions regarding the difference between the medical benefit and the drug benefit? I'll give you a few seconds here to consider.
And I actually see one question in the chat. So does the concept of incident 2 apply to just to Medicare? That is a really good question. So incident 2 services, the only place they're specifically called out across the board is in federal regulation. So they are a service benefit under Medicare, and that's where the rules come from. A lot of commercial plans default to what kind of processes Medicare has, but every commercial plan is going to have different details on whether they do or do not recognize incident 2 services as separately billable or a covered benefit. There's no obligation for a commercial health plan to cover incident 2 services, though in general they do, because another example of an incident 2 service is when a vaccine is administered by a nurse to a patient of the provider. So if the provider orders a drug and doesn't personally administer it, getting that covered is through an incident 2 benefit. So most commercial plans do have an incident 2 benefit, but whether that extends to full encounters, so office visits, is going to be up to the policies of individual commercial plans. At the state level, it will be detailed in state law. If it's not detailed, it's kind of a gray area, but in general, if it's not detailed in state law that incident 2 services, as far as office encounters, are covered, I would kind of stray to the area of being a little more conservative and say an office visit is not.
Thank you. Is there a follow-up question to that? The person who put that in the chat? Oh, it looks like that was Ashley or Dr. Shaber. Any other questions?
Yes, actually, Tom, does anyone know regarding state law for Alaska on that question? Zach, you referenced state law.
I will scan and I'll bring that up. I can send an email.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
But yeah, I'm not, if anyone else knows, please jump in.
Well, I would just echo what you were saying. It would be thinking about the services that we're offering. It would, for a state health plan, I would think that you wouldn't be doing that if under your MPI, because the rendering provider status with that health plan. So
I would say more and more states and payers are moving away from allowing incident 2 services for encounters or performed by individuals recognized as providers, because historically, especially with Medicare, if you could characterize a nurse practitioner's visit as incident to a physician, they could get the full 100% Medicare physician fee schedule rate as opposed to the 0.85 rate of a mid-level provider. Not all states under the Medicaid plan have a different rate for providers. Oregon pharmacist rate, NP rate, ND, MD, they're exactly the same for individuals participating in Medicaid. But in states where they do have that 0.85 under the state plan for mid-levels, I've seen a number of them that used to cover incident to services moved to not covering them outside of administered drugs and incidental supplies, specifically because it had been used as a way to get physician level reimbursement. And as we looked at the claim form, the state has no way of knowing who actually performed it unless they do chart audits. So you can't see on a claim form that this was an incident to service.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. I know we're a little bit over time, but are there any other questions or discussion points?
Tom, I had a question, but it was more related to set them up than it was to what Zach
Okay.
was discussing. So I don't know if there's a better time to discuss that.
Yeah, we'll just pause the recording at the end and we'll stay on. And
Okay.
we clean these recordings up before we post them, so we'll be able to cut anything out. Maybe I'll close out and just thank Dr. Roscoe for doing that overall review. This is a really important piece, especially for pharmacists, to reposition their frame of reference when it comes to billing. We know the drug benefit very well, but understanding that medical benefit has been difficult, and this general knowledge really is the gateway to medical billing. And starting from that reference point really helps pharmacists understand that. So I really appreciate it, Dr. Roscoe. Thank you for joining us. And we will be posting this recording onto the website in about a week or so. And thank you, everybody, and have a good day.